Next week, you're back on normal status. We've had like a 30 to 40% absentee rate, which I trust is because of the rain, not because of people taking advantage of it, but I'll leave it there. All right, turn this off now. Okay. I mentioned this last week, but it's coming now. We'll have makeups on Sundays. They'll be optional. I'll live stream them and record them. If you can't come, you can't come. There's no way I can schedule something during the week, and there's no way I can schedule something at night. At virtually any given point, at least one of you has class or an internship or job or something. So the weekends are the time where there's the most possibility of finding something. So again, I'll be recorded, optional attendance. As long as you tell me that you watched the video and send me an email, you're good. The dean actually worked out a deal with the ABA that said if you watch or record a class, it will count for purposes of attendance. You don't have to watch it live. You can watch it whenever you want, but when you watch it, email me. Okay? I think so. I don't know yet. I requested this room. I'm assuming it's available, but it'll probably be in this room. The powers that be that select rooms are above my pay grade. Yes.
If we watch it off of the live stream on YouTube, can we submit all questions through the YouTube chat function?
Oh God. The YouTube chat function is accessible. What I'll say is this: if you email me a question, I'll try to check at regular intervals to see if anyone emailed me. I don't promise I'll get to it, but I promise I will look at my email as long as it's like a one-sentence email and I recognize the name, I'll open it up. But it's hard for me to read emails during class. I actually used to do something. If you watch my old videos, you'll see evidence of it. I used to have a live chat in class. It was basically it wasn't Twitter, but it was like a Twitter feed where I allowed students to interact with me. It worked well in some classes and it worked poorly in others. Invariably what happened is that one student started making anonymous asshole comments on it, and so I got rid of it about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, I can't remember. But I used to have a feed where you could post questions on the board and type it. It was like it's called a back channel, but I abandoned it because it more often than not it didn't work well, so I got rid of it. Other questions? Anything else in your mind? Again, so I'm going to update the syllabus. Again, today's class 7. Class 8 will be on Thursday. And I will update the syllabus this week so you know exactly what's going to be. One other note, Rosh Hashanah is next Thursday. So there will be no class Rosh Hashanah. Chag Sameach, everyone. So instead we'll be having the class the Friday after. And again, it's optional. If you can't come, you can't come. But that's going to be recorded the same policy. Invariably, one of the Jewish holidays always falls on the day of class, either Wednesday or Thursday. I always get hit every year, so you guys got it this year. So do the best we can. Okay, anything else in your minds? Okay, so let's start, and I want to ask this question. We'll put the polling up. The question is this. Hold on, starting a session. Okay, the question is this. What clause of the Constitution was violated in the first case for today, New York versus United States? Just covering the options. A, the 10th Amendment. B, necessary and proper. C, all of the above. D, none of the above. Okay. What clause of the Constitution was violated in New York versus United States? 10th Amendment. A, the necessary proper clause. B, all the above, none of the above. I know the law students love the all the above, none of the above option because it really messes with you. All right? All right, where was I last week? Who was last off?
I think it was either me or Brittany the last few ago. I can't remember.
Are you next? Thank you. What'd you put?
I put B.
Okay, you put necessary and proper. Okay, why did you put B?
Well, I was thinking about the tape title,
Good, okay.
provision, and how it wasn't, they found it unconstitutional for them to extend that choice between following the federal provision or taking complete liability for the waste.
Okay, so that's a good description of the case, but why is that a necessary and proper issue? I'll get to you in a minute, but we'll go around a bit. Cortland, what'd you put?
I put A,
You put A, so you put 10th Amendment. Why did you put 10th Amendment?
because of the common dealing, concept.
Okay.
It talks about how the federal government can't require states to do certain things.
Okay, okay. Yes, your name
Mark.
tag. Mark, what'd you put, Mark? Make sure you have your name tags. It's, don't take it personally, I have 100 things to get, it's hard for me to keep track.
I also went with A, although I'm recognizing now the question asked for a clause, so,
Oh, no, the 10th Amendment is a clause, absolutely. That's a
Okay.
clause. That's a clause of the Constitution. Why'd you put 10th Amendment?
well, I guess the state officials cannot consent to the enlargement of the powers of Congress beyond those enumerated in the Constitution.
Uh-huh.
And so, by entering into the agreement, they basically went outside of the Federalist purpose of keeping limited powers with Congress and the majority of powers with the states.
Okay. What'd you put?
I picked C, but I went out on a wild guess.
So you said all of the above.
I said all of the above.
Okay, why'd you go with all of the above?
I said all of the above because I think the same reasons that were being made for the 10th Amendment. It's clear in the decision that Congress can't force a state to comply with a federal regulation.
Okay.
So that was why I said that the 10th Amendment was violated.
Uh-huh.
And I was guessing with regards to the necessary and proper clause, but my guess would be that the fact that the backup of the case, even though they didn't talk about it a lot, they basically said that if we can't rely on the 10th Amendment to do this, then it is necessary and proper for us to force the state to do this. But the court still ruled it unconstitutional, so that's why I think it violated.
This is a hard question, isn't it? So, I mean, you guys in your outline, right, we're reading this case, New York versus United States, and I hope some of you are asking, wait a minute, what is the basis for this decision? Did any of you ask yourself that when you were reading this? You should have, right? Justice O'Connor, God love her, doesn't give an answer to this question. She doesn't. I don't know the answer. I think I know the answer, but it's not in the case, right? She talks about the 10th Amendment. She talks about the necessary and proper clause. But she never says, there's not a single sentence, that it doesn't exist. This federal law violates the 10th Amendment. This federal law violates the necessary and proper clause. She doesn't say it, right? Right, she just doesn't say what the answer is. So then how do we understand this opinion? So before we even get to the case, let's do a little review, right? Eric, describe for me, generally speaking, what does the necessary and proper clause accomplish?
What does it accomplish? It helps expand the enumerated powers into saying, well, I guess it sort of reads between the lines of those powers in a sense that it gives Congress a specific power, and then the necessary and that's the enumerated power, and then the necessary and proper clause sort of allows them to go out on a limb and say, well, it doesn't, we're not given this power in so many words, but to accomplish this power, we have to use these means that are necessary and proper to
Okay. So the necessary and proper clause, we've done this before, it expands Congress's powers. The necessary and proper clause gives Congress the power to do additional stuff in order to pursue one of its other enumerated powers, right? And we studied this all the way back in McCulloch v. Maryland. Congress can't create a bank under its enumerated powers, but as a necessary and proper means of doing so, a bank is a good way of regulating commerce. A bank is a good way of imposing taxes, right? We've done this before. But the necessary and proper clause isn't infinite, right? There's a limit on it. It has to be both necessary and proper, different words. Now, we studied these cases somewhat out of chronological order, but we did the Obamacare case last week. And you recall that the Chief Justice, for 5 votes, said that the individual mandate might be a convenient way of regulating the insurance market, might be necessary, but it's not proper. And I told you when we studied that we'd be coming back to 2 cases, which are today, New York and Printz. But what made the mandate not proper was that it commanded a person to buy insurance, right? It said you have to buy insurance. And the court said that that was something that had never been done before. It intruded upon the sovereignty of the individual. And then we come back now to New York, right? What is a necessary and proper clause? It gives Congress extra powers, but are there limits on those powers? In this case, the court suggested that yes, the take care provision, which we'll take title provision, which we'll get to in a minute, runs afoul of that premise. But that's only half of the case, right? Again, this is about 10th Amendment and necessary and proper. So, let's see. Martin, what does a 10th Amendment do? I'll read it first. I'll put it on the screen, right? 10th Amendment. Read it. It's only a sentence.
The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
Okay, what does that mean, Martin?
Well, the term we've been using a lot is police power, and that the states can basically, that it's trying to give as much power to the states as possible so that they maintain a level of autonomy over their citizens.
Okay. Martin, does the 10th Amendment impose any limitations on Congress's powers?
I would feel like inherently it limits it to what's in Article 1.
I'm so glad you answered the question that way. But if that's the case, what difference does the 10th Amendment make? If we already know Congress is going to do what's listed in Article 1, why do we need the 10th Amendment?
Because people like to push the envelope.
No, the framers didn't ratify this to push an envelope. Why do we have a 10th Amendment if it's simply the case that Congress can only do that which is enumerated in Article 1, right? Power is not delegated, okay, so Congress can exercise the powers that are delegated. Donezo. Why do we need this amendment? Why did the framers ratify this 2 years after the Constitution was ratified? Why do we, does the 10th Amendment add anything at all? Does the 10th Amendment add anything? Does it merely just restate what's in Article 1? Why do we even need this?
My guess would be that it allows any power that's not given to the federal government to be given to the states.
Say that again?
Any power that's not given to the federal government can be given to the states. I don't know, that's just a guess.
Laura, let me ask the question again. What does the 10th Amendment add? What does the 10th Amendment add beyond what's already stated in Article 1, Section 8? We already know Congress only has those powers enumerated. What limit does the 10th Amendment even place on federal power? Does it add anything? Yeah. Now, what do you think?
Well, I think that it's creating some type of limitation so that they can't just keep going and going and going, oh, well, this is necessary and proper.
But what limit? What limit does it create? I don't see it. I mean, I'm reading it. It says the power is not delegated or reserved to the states. That's fine. But we already know in Article 1, whatever powers Congress has, the states don't.
Well, but
Is this merely just stating what one judge called a truism, right? That merely whatever is not delegated is retained by the states, like, duh. What does the 10th Amendment even add?
well, I mean, it continues with what Congress has control over grows, has grown, and so it's, I feel like it's attempting to limit how far they can keep expanding.
So I sense all of you are somewhat struggling with this question, and I struggle with it myself. Often I teach this case every year, but I always struggle with it. Does the 10th Amendment add anything at all? So some years ago, some years ago in a case called Darby, which I think we read, the court said the 10th Amendment is but a truism, right? That is, whatever is not delegated to the central government, the states retain. Okay, that's an obvious attribute of our federal system. However, the 10th Amendment, the court has said here, does inform the analysis, right? What makes a law not necessary and proper? What is one of the ways that we can assess a law as not being proper? This is where the 10th Amendment comes into play. Because what Justice O'Connor says in New York and what Justice Scalia says in Printz and what Chief Justice Roberts later says in NFIB is that what makes a law improper is it infringes on state sovereignty through the 10th Amendment. Everyone see that, right? What makes the law, this take title provision, the Handgun Act, right? What makes these things not proper is not simply the judge's own sense of propriety, which maybe it is, maybe it's not, but because it distorts the scheme we have between the federal and the state governments. So the answer to this question, I'll see what people put. I don't know the answer. I cooked this up last night. I was prepping for class. Like, let me put this one. All right, a little bit of everything. Most people said A, which was 10th Amendment, and then some people said B. I would probably put C if I had to guess. D is a good red herring because O'Connor and Faith said neither actually applies. I think the better answer is C. But with the caveat of this, what makes the law improper is that it intrudes upon the 10th Amendment. Everyone understand what I just said, right? 1 second, Jeff. What makes the law improper is because it intrudes on state sovereignty. I think I had questions. Adam and then Jeff, your hand up a minute ago?
I have a comment, but you said it better.
Good, I love when that happens. That's why I say, I'll be right back to say this. Yeah. Yes.
Just in respect to how to answer what the 10th Amendment adds, does it add structure? Because it provides, or it gives a provision to what is proper?
Well, you just nailed O'Connor's opinion, right? You said O'Connor's opinion correctly, but can you get that straight from reading the Constitution?
No.
No, isn't she? She's right, right? So where did O'Connor get this from? See, now this is the question, right? O'Connor tap dances around this, right? She doesn't actually say, you just said it really clear, right? You just said, you can say it again, you said exactly right.
Okay.
Say what you exactly right. Just say it one more time, please.
The 10th Amendment gives provisions in order to define what is necessary and proper.
Yes, right? So in other words, when you're looking to see if a law is necessary and proper, one of your guideposts is the 10th Amendment. Now, Jay's questioning was a smart one. She's like, where the hell do you get that from, Blackman, right? Like, where does that come from? And so what, do you have an answer to your question?
Not at all.
No, that's what she asked it, right? So her question, I think, is a good one, right? Her question is, where does O'Connor articulate this understanding that the law is improper because it intrudes upon state sovereignty? And here, and I fully concede this point, her argument is underdeveloped, as we would say. That is, it doesn't really exist. Scalia does a better job of hitting it in Printz, because it was like maybe 5 or 6 years later and they had some time to think about it. And I think Roberts does an even better job in the Obamacare decision, except another decade to think about it. But if you read the dissents by Justice White, by Justice Stevens, and then by Breyer later, like, you guys are making this up. You're making this up. This is nowhere to be found, right? You can articulate a coherent theory that it not being proper, but this is, they say, not grounded in the text of the Constitution. Now, I'll give a little bit of defense for Justice O'Connor. If you read McCullough v. Maryland, go always back to John Marshall, Marshall suggested that there might be a limit that's not consistent with the spirit of the Constitution. Remember that line? The spirit of the Constitution. I think I asked someone, I can't remember what it was, what the hell does that mean, the spirit of the Constitution? I don't know. But I think it's plausible and proper that one of the attributes of this spirit is federalism, which is embodied in the 10th Amendment. So again, this is not like rocket science. It's not like, you know, Euclidean geometry, everything fits in together. I think there's a good argument that O'Connor makes, but Jay's question is on point because it's not developed. And she almost mentions it as like an afterthought, which is, oh yeah, it's not proper, blah, blah, move on. Like she knows that it doesn't have a strong pedigree in history, so they have to do some other stuff. Yes, Martin.
So to kind of sum up what you're saying about what the 10th Amendment adds, it's making explicit what is implicit in the Article 1.
Making explicit what is implicit. I love that, but please explain that for your classmates.
Oh, so because Article 1 doesn't say these powers are reserved to the states, but it's somewhat implied.
Right, so Article 1, Section 1 says all the powers here enumerated are in Congress, right? The implication of that is the powers that are not enumerated gotta go somewhere else, which is the states. So in that case, all the 10th Amendment does is it just restates Article 1, Section 1. Right? It literally restates Article 1, Section 1, which is why my question is, does the 10th Amendment add anything to the Article 1, or just restates it? Now, I think the answer has to be, the framers wouldn't ratify something that merely restates what's already there. It has to do something else, right? You don't ratify an amendment that's worthless. We assume that the words of the Constitution are not surplus, that they have weight. But what they mean wasn't really given much focus until the 1980s and 1990s in the Rehnquist Court. Brandon.
Didn't they have to vest those powers somewhere? I mean,
they could have kept them all at the states. They could have just given Congress no power. That was entirely feasible.
But I mean, the 10th Amendment, I mean, the residual powers, or the other powers could have been vested in, like, your civic government or local
Well,
government.
but the starting point is the states already have the full police power. And when the states ratified the Constitution, the people gave up some of their police power to this new central government. Not all of it, they gave some. But again, that's merely restating Article 1, Section 1. The powers here and granted are in Congress, and everything else is in the states. Case.
Could the states, or some of the states, just really insisted on it being written in the Constitution?
Like, we really mean it, right?
Yeah, like, they're like, oh, we're
Damn
not
it.
doing this unless you write it and have it in the Constitution, that the states get these powers?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's perfectly plausible. It's basically saying, we really mean it, right? We don't want to leave this implication implied. We'll make it explicit, right? We're going to make it clear. But if that's the case, it just merely restates it with certainty. It doesn't add anything new. The question you keep asking is, does the 10th Amendment add anything else beyond restating it explicitly? And the court hasn't really addressed that. They basically say, well, it means what it says, but what it says is a principle that can explain the spirit of the law, right? Montesquieu, right? The spirit of the Constitution. Everyone with me? Yeah.
And is Article 1, Section 1, when it refers to the House of Representatives, that's...
I mean, Article 1, Section 8, yeah. I'm sorry, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1.
Right, but I'm actually reading Article 1,
Okay.
Section 1. All
Please.
legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Is the House of Representatives analogous to the people in Article 1, or in the 10th Amendment?
No. No, the Congress, the House of Representatives, is the federal government. The state government is where the police powers reside. Yeah, the people in the 10th Amendment. Here, I'll bring it back up. The people, right? The people are the people of the states, not the people in Congress.
But didn't you mention before that the House of Representatives is closer to the people?
Yes, it's elected by the people. It's not the people themselves. They're federal officers, full of public trust. All right, come on with me. This little discourse, right? I did this deliberately. All right, Emily. Let's do New York, right? Let's give me the facts in the case are a little bit complicated. Walk me through the facts, please.
Congress enacted a law to address the public policy concern of radioactive.
Low-level radioactive.
Low-level from.
What's low-level radioactive waste?
From lots of different things such as luminous. What did it say? Luminous watch dials.
You know the glow-in-the-dark watches? Like, remember those?
Yeah.
You have one, so you can see it at night?
Yeah.
So you are carrying low-level radioactive waste. Okay, go on.
Okay. So only the first law that Congress passed in 1980 basically didn't penalize any state that didn't dispose of this waste.
But what was the problem with low-level radioactive waste? Why was this a national problem?
That they weren't disposing. States weren't disposing of it.
Why weren't states disposing of this waste? What was the shortage? Like, what was missing?
Well, there are only 3 states that operated in this disposal.
So this is, I often bleed ConLaw into property. Here I'll bleed property into ConLaw. NIMBY, you know that expression?
Not in my backyard.
Thank you. Not in my backyard, right? Thank you. Very good. Not in my backyard. No one wants to build a radioactive dump in their backyard, right? No one. It's not good for homeownership. People don't want it in their backyard. So as a result, in the entire country, there are only 3 of these landfills to store the radioactive waste. Unsurprising. And these poor 3 states, was it Nevada, Washington, and South Carolina, were stuck basically absorbing the radioactive waste from the other 47 states. And these 3 states, they said, look, we don't want to be the dumping ground of the entire country. We're going to eventually run out of space, and we don't have to deal with all this, waste. Okay. So Congress said, we have a national problem. Let's pass a federal law to deal with it. And Emily mentioned that there was a law in 1980 that said states can come together and make compacts, which are basically like treaties between states. Congress can approve them, which allow for the disposal of waste. Shocker, 5 years after the statute passed, not a single new waste dump was built. So these compacts proved to be an utter waste of time. Given some more time, almost like a third of the nation would have had nowhere to put their waste. Okay. So then in 1985, Congress passes the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Amendments Act of 1985. So the 3 states with dumps, the landfills it is, I'm from Staten Island, which had the world's largest landfill. It was shut down when I was a teen, but it used to stink really bad. Under the terms of this agreement, the 3 states with landfills would accept waste for another 7 years until 1992. Okay. What happened in 1992? The states could then start excluding waste from other states. That wasn't problematic, right? There's no way that we can force, South Carolina to take waste from New York. So to prevent the situation happening where states have nowhere to send their waste, and really it's not even the states, it's private companies, right? If you're the Timex company, you're making watches, I don't know, and you have all this radioactive waste, where are you going to send it? So Congress said we'll create 3 sets of incentives. Incentives, you have a carrot and you have a stick. All right, Shivan, what were these incentives designed to encourage states to comply with these obligations to take care of the waste generated in their borders? What were these incentives?
So the first one were monetary incentives.
Okay.
The second one were access incentives.
Okay, well, what are the monetary incentives? Walk me through that.
Another big one was the last one.
Well, the big one's the last one, yeah, we'll get there in a minute. Let's talk about the monetary incentives. Yeah, the facts of the case are tricky, but they're important to understand.
Yeah, I don't know what the monetary.
Brittany? What were the monetary incentives?
I know it's something about a surcharge and they could tax them.
Okay. So is there any problem with Congress telling companies or states in New York that if you want to ship waste to South Carolina, you have to pay for it? Is there any problem with that? Okay. So there's no problem with the incentive payments, right? There's no problem with that whatsoever. Okay? Kelly, what was the second type of incentive?
Denial to the access sites.
Okay. So basically, if by 1992 you don't build the waste, you can't ship any more garbage to South Carolina. Is there any constitutional problem there?
I don't think so.
Right. Why? There's nothing that Congress can do to force a state to accept waste from another state. They just can't do it. So the only incentive that we care about, the third one is the most severe, is what's called the take title provision. So trying to start us off, we may take a couple people with this one, but start us off. What is this take title provision?
They have to take title to the waste.
Who's they?
The state which produces the waste.
Okay, so be careful. Let's say the waste is produced by the Timex company, right? That's private waste. What does it mean for the state to take title to this waste? What does it actually mean legally?
If the state doesn't have a place for them to properly dispose of it.
Exactly. So what this does is actually pretty ambitious. If you're a company and you're creating this radioactive waste, making watches or making, smoke detectors, whatever it is, in the state of New York, if your state didn't create a method for you to dispose of it, it's not your responsibility anymore. It's the responsibility of your state. So New York literally takes ownership, that is, takes title of this waste. And with that, the state is now liable for disposing of it. And, oh, by the way, it's liable for damages. Because usually if you're a company and you're making some good that generates radioactive waste, you're on the hook for the damages, right? That's your problem. But Congress shifted. They said, okay, corporations, you're not liable anymore. Now your government, which failed to do what it's supposed to do, is liable. Okay? Now, Jay, I'll go to you for a minute. Did New York have any laws on the books about taking title or taking ownership of radioactive waste at the time? So what would New York have had to do to actually comply with this federal law? What would the New York legislature have to do?
In order to comply with the federal law?
Yeah, in order for the New York legislature to actually take ownership of this waste, what would New York have had to do?
Violate it.
Well, generally, how does any state government act? What do they have to do first? Can they just act arbitrarily, say, all right, whatever? Okay, and how do they carry it through? How would a state government implement that? What would they have to do first? What would the state legislature have to do?
I don't think they apply to the federal government. I don't really know how they would.
Close. Rosario, what would the state have to do to comply with this federal law? The state legislature in particular.
I want to say they would follow whatever they were told. So.
What does it mean follow? How does the state government act? What does a state do to act? They just act arbitrarily, say, all right, here's what we're going to do. How do states operate? What do they do?
They work for the people.
Okay, and then what do they do?
They ask the people to vote using on whether they want.
Well, I mean, we don't even have direct democracy in bills. What has to happen? You're on the right track. Viviana? Oh, sorry. I heard you. I think you whispered it.
Pass the bill.
Pass a bill. See? You're good. I heard you whisper it. Pass a bill, right? In order for New York to comply with this federal regime, the legislators in Albany will be required to pass a new law and say that we are now taking title under state law of this waste, and here's how we're going to deal with it, right? The federal law doesn't give the guidance of what states are supposed to do. It just says, here, you got to do this. And then it's up to the state legislatures in Albany to actually implement it, right? Now, John, let me ask you a question. What happens if the people in Albany, upstate New York, say, screw this, we're not passing this bill? I'm not doing it. Okay. What if the people vote it down? What if it's like a closed vote but it gets voted down? What happens then?
The state's not going to comply with the...
No. So then what's problematic about this federal law? What is it actually doing beyond dealing with radioactive waste? Why is this actually problematic? It's not just requiring the states to take title of the waste, right? Why exactly is this problematic?
Well, it's demanding that they pass a law.
They legislate. Exactly. It's demanding that the state legislatures pass a bill and the governor signs it.
Everyone see, this case is not merely about whether New York can take ownership of radioactive waste. The threshold question is whether Congress can require or commandeer, to use the language, the state to pass a bill and implement this federal program. Right? It's not merely complying with the federal law. I think that's what Jay and Rosario are getting at. It's not merely complying with the federal law. They have to actually create new state laws to provide for how to dispose of this waste and everything else. And what if New York doesn't want to have this law? And the people of Albany, Albany is the capital of New York, the people of Albany vote it down in violation of federal law. So that's why this case presented a difficulty. Now, the irony is, right? The irony is that New York wanted this. Everyone appreciate that, right? Before this bill was created, a number of states provided suggestions of how to deal with this problem. And New York was one of the states that recommended this very bill. And once it was passed, they turned around and sued the federal government. Very chutzpah, right? It's like the orphan who kills his parents and begs for mercy, right? But did that matter to the court? Not really. Because they said states can't relinquish their sovereignty because it's designed to protect not the state, but the people of the state. So that's the basis of the case, right? Can Congress make New York legislate on the issue of taking ownership of the radioactive waste? That's the basic issue. Everyone can see that, right? So Rachel, how then, and we alluded to this before, how does Justice O'Connor describe the relationship between enumerated powers and the 10th Amendment?
Oh man, that's a big question.
It's a good question, yes. That's why I asked it.
I feel like the 10th Amendment almost, it doesn't limit, but it
What does O'Connor say? I'm asking your opinion. I'll welcome your opinion afterwards, but first I want what O'Connor said.
Okay.
What does O'Connor say is relationship between the enumerated power doctrines and the 10th Amendment?
Well, so she discusses the 10th Amendment is in violation when Congress directs states to regulate in a particular field in a particular way.
Let's talk about enumerated powers. Talk about enumerated powers first. Maybe that'll help.
Well, they discuss the Commerce Clause.
Is this a regulation of commerce? I don't think the Commerce Clause is really important here.
Let me see. She does discuss the Commerce Clause, but she knocks it down. She says Congress is constrained in the exercise of that power by the First Amendment. And the 10th Amendment likewise restrains the power of Congress.
Lacey, what do you think? How does O'Connor describe the relationship between enumerated powers in Article 1 of the 10th Amendment?
Say it one more time. Between enumerated powers and the 10th Amendment?
How does O'Connor explain the relationship?
I don't think I can adequately.
Give it a try.
Well, were there like 3 things that she discussed and like one of them didn't work? Does that make sense?
Okay. I think it's Deb. What? Benjamin? What are you saying?
My name is Benjamin.
Benjamin. Oh, I think it's Benchman.
No, sorry.
Oh.
I forgot my paper.
Benjamin. That's a good nickname for a judge. Benjamin, sorry.
Was it that she said it violates the core state sovereignty enshrined in the 10th Amendment by forcing states to choose between the federalist structure?
Let me try this a different way. O'Connor almost describes the doctrine of enumerated powers in the 10th Amendment as 2 sides of a coin, right? You think of it that way. When you're focusing on enumerated powers, right, that's the stuff that Congress doesn't have. It's on the other side. And when you're focusing on the stuff that the states have, the police power, one side, it's the stuff that Congress doesn't have. So they're two sides of the same coin. But it's not just a coin, because it's not fixed. It's not like 50-50. Under the original Constitution, the states had this humongous police power, and the feds had a fairly limited view. But throughout the 18th and 19th century and into the New Deal period, that flipped. And now the feds have all this power, and you have this little tiny sphere left for the states. O'Connor is not arguing with that. She doesn't reject that. She's not reversing the New Deal. But what she is suggesting is that the federal structure puts limits on Congress's powers. And that's actually the topic for this week, right? How does federalism put limits on Congress's powers? We've already talked about the limits that enumerated powers puts. That is, the Commerce Clause, you can only regulate economic activity. But here, it's what limits does federalism put on federal power? And one of those limits the court derives is the commandeering principle. And that is the principle that the federal government cannot command the states to act. Specifically in this case, the federal government cannot command the states to legislate. Okay? That the federal government can't command the states to legislate. And be very careful, right? Her opinion is entirely about making the states legislate. Okay? Now, where am I? Daniel, I can't see back here. Every year I teach, my vision gets worse. It's very more. When I started here, I didn't have glasses. I only got glasses last year, so it's just, and my foot's hurting, that's why I'm sitting. Daniel. Took an old man. Daniel. Oh, I forgot my question, such a big wind up. Generally, when Congress legislates, do they legislate on people or on the states? On people. Now, give me an example of a law that how Congress regulates people. We've done a bunch of them. Good, yeah. They make you buy health insurance, or they make you not grow too much wheat, right? Or they say you can't carry a gun in a school zone, or they say you can't sell food at a place that's segregated, right? Generally, Congress operates on individuals, and historically this wasn't seen as a problem. But it's very rare that Congress legislates on states. So the principle that Justice O'Connor derives is that federalism is designed to protect the states. If Congress wants to legislate directly on people, they can. Now, you actually mentioned Obamacare, right? That's legislation on people that was invalidated. So one of the things that I don't like with going out of order, their advantages, but here O'Connor's making a big fuss about saying this commandeering doctrine is about legislating against people. You can't commandeer states, but you can commandeer people. Obamacare said, no, you can't commandeer people either. In fact, if you think about it, the individual mandate amounts to a commandeering of the people. It was making them take an action. And that the court said was improper. It was not constitutional. So New York is actually very much in tension with the Obamacare decision, and as well as in Printz. But at least here O'Connor says that the government can regulate people, but not the legislative process. Okay? Now, Andre, does that mean that Congress lacks the power to, let's say, encourage the states to do stuff?
No, that does not mean that.
How can Congress encourage the states to do stuff?
Incentives?
Oh, thank you so much. Incentives, what case is that? You did it last week or the week before, I can't remember. Recently.
Yeah, South Dakota.
Yes, bingo. What was South Dakota Beadle? Very good. What was the case about?
That was drinking and driving.
Close.
Teen drinking and driving.
And what did Congress do? How did Congress try to stop drunk driving?
By taking away funding for the highways.
100%. Very good. By the way, you need to do this for the exam. You need to know cases like that. Just the way he just did it, you gotta do that cold. South Dakota v. Dole was a case about incentives, right? Congress can go to the states, hey, if you like that highway fund, that's nice, raise your drinking age, and we'll give you some highway funds. That's fine. In the Obamacare case, it said there's a line they can't withdraw too much money, but as a general matter, Congress can dangle incentives, say, here, if you want this nice highway funding, go raise your drinking age. So Congress can encourage states to take action under the spending power. Right? They can also regulate private activity and say you can't have a segregated restaurant, right? But what O'Connor says is Congress has never had a regime where they forced a state to legislate. Right? They can use their Commerce Clause powers, they use their spending powers, but they can't force a state to legislate. So as a result, the third provision, the take title provision, was unconstitutional. Okay? The third provision was unconstitutional. And again, she doesn't say exactly whether it was the 10th Amendment or necessary and proper, but I think the best way of reading it is, this was not a proper exercise of federal power precisely because it ran afoul of the principle of the 10th Amendment. Right? Let me say it again. This was not a proper exercise of federal power precisely because it ran afoul of the 10th Amendment. I think that's the best way of reading O'Connor's opinion. She didn't say that, but I think that's my take on it. Okay? And it didn't matter that Congress consented. I'm sorry, that New York consented, that New York supported this bill. States cannot give up their sovereignty. Why? She says, because federalism secures the citizens the liberties that derive from diffusion of power. Right? Jonathan, why does O'Connor say that federalism secures individual liberty? In what sense? How does that work? Right? How does decentralization secure individual liberty? What do you mean? Yeah, but why can't Congress protect individual liberty? Why are the states any better at it? Closer to the people. What difference does that make?
They understand their needs.
Oh, very good, right? So Jonathan says that the states are better protecting the liberties of the people than Congress. Okay? That is more or less what the Rehnquist Court has held, the notion that when you have a separation of powers and you have a government closer to the people, they can be more responsive to those people's needs. The flip side of that is that when you have a central government that has a one-size-fits-all policy for the entire country, it's not very responsive. I'll give you an example. We cited the Gun-Free School Zone Act last week. Maybe New York wants to ban all guns in schools, and maybe Texas wants to allow people who are licensed carry holders to bring a gun to school. In fact, that's what Texas has done, right? But when you have a single one-size-fits-all policy nationwide, you can't get the diversity of opinions. You can't get that diffusion of sovereignty. So in that sense, O'Connor says federalism promotes it. So here, right, if New York wants to allow its people to have radioactive waste that's dumped in streams or whatever, that's New York's choice. But Congress can't force it to legislate in that matter. If Congress wants, they can simply spend and give them money to do it. They can regulate it under the commerce power of private businesses. Or it can even issue what's called preemption. They can just say the federal government will take control of all federal waste and then damn to be the states. But they haven't done that. So as a result, the Supreme Court strikes down the take care. I'm thinking take care. There's a take care clause in the Constitution. I always get this confused. The take title provision. Questions on O'Connor's opinion in the New York? Brandon?
Could the executive power of the state just enforce the federal statute without even going to legislation?
Well, isn't that the case in Printz? Isn't that the issue in Printz? Where a sheriff who's a member of the executive branch of the state is asked to enforce the gun control law. We'll get there in a few minutes. But you're right, the O'Connor opinion is only about state legislatures. That's all it's about. It gets expanded.
But could New York have just done it anyway without even going to legislation?
how can New York assume liability for waste without legislation, right? Governments don't act arbitrarily. Say, all right, we'll just take this waste, put it in our backyard, right? You need to have law. You need to have law. Okay? Questions? Questions on the O'Connor opinion? All right, let's do that. Justice White. Elizabeth, what does Justice White say? Why does Justice White think this is a very necessary and important law?
Just pragmatically, we need it.
Why do we pragmatically need it? What is the nature of this problem?
It's radioactive waste. Nobody wants to deal with it.
Is this a local problem or a national problem? It's a national problem, right? A national problem. And this is an important point. Can any one state deal with this radioactive waste problem by itself? No. It requires a national solution. A national solution. And because it requires a national solution, Justice White says, the body of government responsible for it would be Congress. Congress is the body of government for national solutions, and that's why Congress can do it. This is what's often called collective action federalism. Collective action federalism. The idea is when there's a problem that takes a lot of different states to fix, it's up to the central government to fix it. Indeed, this was one of the arguments in the healthcare case, that this idea of health insurance is a national problem, people going from hospitals to one state to the next, you can't have local governments fix it. And the government actually argued that healthcare was unique, that it had a national problem. Not exactly, but that was the government's argument. And the bottom line, White says, is New York has reaped the benefits of this law, and now they object to it, right? They supported this law, now they're benefiting from it, and now they're going to object to it. Zach, what is Justice Stevens' concurring opinion? Dissenting opinion.
He's saying they pretty much solved the problem between the states.
I'm sorry?
He's saying that they solved the problem between the states.
Mm-hmm. Does Justice Stevens see any problem whatsoever with the feds commanding the states to legislate? Why does he see no problem with that?
He says they do it, they've done it before. He says they direct the state governments to many realms, in terms of railroads, school systems, prisons.
Yeah. He gives an example. He says, in times of war, Congress order the states to draft citizens or to command states. Right? He loves this war example. He often brings it up. He'll come back to that in his opinion in Printz, right? Does Congress actually have this power? But Stevens takes a very different historical argument, saying that this commandeering doctrine is a fiction, and it's made up. Again, none of these arguments are very well fleshed out here. This was 91, 92. You wouldn't get to it until Printz was 96 or 97, much later. Okay? All right. Questions on New York versus United States. Questions on New York, United States? Okay. So to summarize the O'Connor decision, Congress lacked the power to command state legislators to act. And this was a reflection of both the 10th Amendment and a law that perhaps was necessary but not proper. Okay? Let's go into Printz. So while New York, United States was about commandeering state legislatures, Printz was about commandeering state executive officers. This was, I think, Brandon's question a minute ago. The facts of Printz involved a provision of the Brady Handgun Act. This was a law that was passed in the wake, not the wake, but in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on President Reagan, and his Secret Service agent Brady was shot and severely wounded. Eventually, he passed from his injuries some years later. The Brady Handgun Act had a provision, and it said all firearms that are purchased from dealers must undergo a background check before they're sold. Okay. This required a database to be developed. It's called the National Instant Criminal Background Check Database, or the NICS. And if any of you ever bought a gun, you know exactly what this is. You go to the gun store, you give your information, and maybe 5 or 10 minutes later it gives you an okay, right? It's not instant that like it's right away, but it's pretty quick. It's within a single sitting. But that database hadn't been built yet when this case came up. So the drafters of the Brady Act had this genius idea. They said, okay, we got it. Until this database is built, we will require local law enforcement officials, the chief law enforcement official in each jurisdiction, to run background checks for us. What could go wrong, right? Well, America. In the United States, there's a very strong tradition of gun ownership, one which foreign students never seem to understand, but I say welcome to Texas. And shortly after this bill was enacted, sheriffs in different parts of the country brought suit, arguing that this law commandeered them, that this law compelled them to perform these background checks. Okay? Now, take it from me. These sheriffs, there is a 0% chance they would have actually done this. They probably believe the entire law is unconstitutional. And their position was, if this is so important, go send an ATF agent to Ravalli County, Montana, and let him run a background check. I ain't doing it, right? So here are actually the plaintiffs, and these pictures will be in your next book. It's not in your current one, I don't think. So from left to right, this is Dave Hardy, who's an attorney from Arizona. This is Sheriff Richard Mack. That's Stephen Halbrook, and that's Sheriff Jay Printz. Printz is the lead plaintiff in the case. Mack was a sheriff from Arizona, and Printz was a sheriff from Montana. Printz looks the role. Look at this guy, the barrel chest, right? I love this picture. He absolutely looks the part, especially this picture. He was actually not only the town sheriff, he was also the town coroner. Because when you're in Ravalli County, Montana, it's not very populated. You're going to be the sheriff, you're going to be the lawman, you can be the coroner, you can do everything. Printz was also a board member of the National Rifle Association. These cases were not Second Amendment decisions, but they had the Second Amendment lurking in the background. Like Justice Thomas's concurring opinion makes that point. But these cases were in large measure funded by gun rights groups, because they realized that this would be a huge expansion of federal powers over firearms. Okay? And they argued that, wait a minute, we have this decision, this New York versus United States decision, which was a couple years old, and we're being commandeered. Now, again, the holding in New York was about commandeering state officials. This case had nothing to do with the states. It didn't require the states to pass a single bill. It merely said to the chief law enforcement officials, you got to run this background check on your people. Now, this is actually a picture of the case being argued. Justice Scalia, this was the rare period we had a beard. It was you can see him right over here. There was a brief period we had a beard, and there are not many pictures of it. This is one of them. The beard did not work well for him. Bad luck. The things I worry about. Anyway, where did I leave off? I don't remember. Anthony. I'm sorry?
Oh, no, I'm laughing.
No, so Chief Justice Taft had the best mustache. I think Holmes was a close second. But the justices, there's an entire thing on justice facial hair. It's a thing. People with facial hair, tend to be less trustworthy. It's like no, it's true though, because modern politicians don't have facial hair.
Abraham Lincoln. He grew a beard.
No, back then it was like a thing, but in modern culture, facial hair doesn't work well. So my bearded friends, it's Movember coming up soon. So
No shade.
I trust you. It's okay. I trust you also. But Anthony, distract us. What were the facts in What were the facts in Printz?
He's lying.
Can't trust
He's
him.
lying. Yeah. All right, Anthony, give me the facts, please.
Well, they
Do
passed.
you want to take an oath first, or? That's cool. Go for it.
They passed the Brady Act.
Okay.
Which required them to do background checks. I think they didn't want to do it.
Well, yeah. Why do you think these sheriffs had no interest in actually implementing this? Let me put Sheriff Printz back up on the screen. Why do you think Sheriff Printz had no interest in implementing this law?
You didn't look like you wanted to be told what to do.
Damn straight. You said it better than I could have ever. You redeemed the beard, okay? He had no interest in some guy in Washington telling him how to manage the safety in his own county, right? He had no interest in that whatsoever. Moreover, I know Printz. We actually emailed him years ago. He actually has a funny story. So the first sheriff, I said his name was Mack. Sheriff was it Richard Mack? He sent me this email years ago, and he said, "Josh, stop calling it Printz, right? The United States. Call it Mack, the United States." Okay. What was his reasoning? Alphabetical order. He said, "Look, Josh, my name is M, he's P, I come first. Stop calling it Prince of the United States." Okay. So he's wrong. The reason why it's Prince is not because of the name of the parties. It has to do with the number of their petition, right? Every new petition that goes to the court gets a new unique number. Prince filed his petition first, so his number is lower. And because his number is lower, it's called Prince of the United States, not Mack of the United States. In any event, actually, Mack, by the way, was at the Bundy Ranch last year, or whatever it was. He's gone to his second career. Case, why do you think Mack or Prince weren't interested in having guys in Washington tell them how to manage their county?
Well, they probably had enough to do already, too. They
Good.
had a tremendous workload.
Yeah. Walk me through the process, right? What were the sheriffs required to do under this provision of this law?
Just to perform background checks
And before computers, I can tell you there were no computers in Raleigh County, Montana in 1995, right? How do you perform these sort of background checks before this database existed?
I guess you'd have to investigate first.
Yeah, exactly, okay? So here's how the process would have worked, right? When a person wants to buy a handgun, they have to fill out a form and put information. Then the dealer has to provide the form to the local chief law enforcement officer and give him a copy. The dealer must wait 5 days before the sale proceeds, which would give the law enforcement officer time to determine whether the transaction was lawful. Okay? The sheriff must make an effort to resolve within 5 days. He must. He's not required to take any action, but he must investigate it. And if the law enforcement officer says that the deal is that he's ineligible, he must provide a written reason for doing so. And a violation of the Brady Act is a fine of 1 year in jail. But think about this for a minute, right? You got this guy. Go back to Sheriff Printz. He's the only lawman in town, right? It's basically him. He's also the coroner. He's so busy dealing with cattle rustling and I don't know what else people do there, right? But it's busy. And now he's dealing with this crap, right? Run background checks on people, provide the written notifications, investigate this history, okay? But also, there's now a 5-day waiting period for guns. That's a big deal. Before that, in Montana, you wanted a gun, you bought a gun. There was no waiting period. So this imposed a 5-day waiting period of buying a handgun, which was, I think, part of the regime. So Printz and Mack, they objected. I think Case is exactly right. It's not just they didn't want to be told what to do. They had other priorities. So this law forced them to restructure their priorities and to deal with this problem. Right? They didn't have to before, now they did. So they filed suits across the country in Montana and Arizona and elsewhere, and the court split on this. So Justice Scalia, far more than Justice O'Connor, traces the history of the commandeering doctrine, right? Carlo, how does Scalia understand the commandeering doctrine? Where does he think it derives from? Like, how does he develop this?
I would think, maybe from necessary and proper.
Okay, why?
Well, because the federal government is essentially taking over, in this case, the executives in order to affect their end goal of.
Very good.
conducting these background
So, right, so could Congress regulate the sale of guns under its commerce powers? Of course, right? If you want to buy a gun, interstate commerce, economic activity, substantial effect, that's fine. But this isn't merely regulating the purchase of the gun. It's doing something beyond that. Specifically, it's requiring the local sheriff to do this background check. So the question is, can you sweep in the background checks under necessary and proper, right? You have an enumerated power, you have commerce, that's fine. But can you add on to that? In other words, is it necessary and proper to have an effective gun control scheme to make these sheriffs background check? Kevin, shaking your head no?
It's necessary, but it's not proper.
Why not?
Because it's intruding on the state's police powers.
But is it the state's police powers or whose? Who is it intruding on? Be very precise here. Who? Montana doesn't have to do a damn thing. Who is being intruded upon?
The state officials.
The officials, right? So here we have an expansion of New York. New York said state legislatures. Here in Printz, we moved on to state executive branch officials. Everyone see that move. Scalia doesn't make a big fuss about it, but that's a significant difference. And Stevens makes hell about it in his dissent. But the move Scalia makes here, he expands it. Okay? Now, the textual basis for the commandeering doctrine, as I put up there, is not exactly clear. But there is one piece of textual evidence that supports it, which is the Supremacy Clause. Right? So, David, read the Supremacy Clause first. I have it up on the board. You can look in your book.
The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding.
Very good. Okay. So the highlighted point, the highlighted part, the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. What does that mean? What are the judges bound by? The state judges, that is.
To follow federal law.
Okay. So the judges are bound to follow federal law. David, does it speak about the state executive or state legislative officials here?
No.
So what does Scalia say about that? What does Scalia make about that? What's the significance that it only speaks of judicial branch officials, but not state executive or legislative branch officials? Right. What does it usually mean in law where one thing's listed, the other things aren't listed? Like what does that usually suggest?
I mean that it's not that you can't, I guess, compel the state legislatures and executives.
So Kevin, let me finish up here really close. If the state judges are bound by federal law, are state executive and legislative officials bound by federal law?
No.
Yes. Okay. Good. Very good. That's Scalia's argument, one of them at least, right? State legislative officials and state executive branch officials aren't listed there. Therefore, they're not bound by federal law. Okay? They're not bound by federal law. Yeah, Mark.
So it was about this point in the reading when I Googled, can a state police officer arrest you for a federal crime? And the general Google result was yes.
Well, I'm loath to trust Google, but, so there are two questions, right? Can a state official arrest you for violating federal law? And must a state official arrest you for violating federal law? And I'll ask you my next question, which is about 20 minutes time, I'll do it now. Sanctuary cities. So the definition of a sanctuary city is somewhat hard to define, but as a general matter, it is a policy whereby a city will not cooperate with federal law enforcement officials in various respects. So for example, let's say that someone in a jail cell, right, is not here legally. And the feds say to the prison, hey, we want you to hold this person, so when he gets out of jail, we can go deport him. Okay? The sanctuary city says, yeah, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to comply. We're going to let him out. We're going to let him out. You do whatever you want. We're not going to help you. Adam, can Congress compel a sheriff of Houston or San Francisco or any other city to detain someone in order for them to be removed from deportation or whatever? Can they commandeer state prison to make them hold people for removal? What's the rule in Printz?
No,
Why not?
it's not a state, judiciary.
Yeah, yeah. There's an irony, and I've noted this several times the last 6 months or so, that Printz arose in a case protecting gun rights. But the exact same principle is now being used to protect sanctuary cities. People don't care about irony, it doesn't really matter much, right? But the bottom line is this, right? The bottom line is this. Under Scalia's principle in Printz, the federal government can't commandeer or compel state officials to implement federal law, right? If Congress wants to run background checks in Ravalli County, Montana, they can send an ATF agent, that's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They can send an ATF agent down to Ravalli County, Montana. If Congress wants to arrest and deport people in San Francisco or Houston, they can't commandeer the San Francisco sheriff. They can commandeer the Houston sheriff. They can send down ICE agents, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They can send ICE agents to the jail cells, have them waiting outside, right? But they can't force them to do it. In fact, in California, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court has said that we don't even want federal agents, federal immigration agents, in courthouses. Because what they'll sometimes do is just wait in the courthouse until someone has a hearing and pick them up. And the California Justice has said, we don't even want that. We don't want you in our courts at all. Brittany?
Is this partially how they've gotten marijuana passed in states?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, taking the Commerce Clause out of it, because isn't that basically illegal under federal law, but states are now allowing people to use it legally?
Oh, what a good question. Okay, so we did Gonzales v. Raich a few weeks ago, right? And we said that Congress has the power to regulate even locally grown marijuana. Brittany, are states required to criminalize marijuana? No, they're not. Could Congress require a state to criminalize marijuana?
Based on this, I would say no, because they can't force them to pass a law.
Yeah, so let's do this in 2 steps, right? First, Congress can't force Colorado's legislature to criminalize marijuana. That's New York, the United States. Second, Congress can't force the Colorado Police Department, Denver, whatever, right? Congress can't force the Denver PD to enforce federal marijuana laws. So if the state of Colorado wants to legalize marijuana, they can do that. The feds can come in and enforce it, the backstop, right? But Colorado can do what it wants. The Colorado law is constitutional. And this is a point people don't get. It's not preempted, right? Even though something is criminal under federal law, the states can still legalize it locally. And the effect of that, of course, is you don't double dip, right? You can't be prosecuted for state and federal offense. So the states remain free to legalize marijuana. They can. They can legalize crack if they wanted to. I don't think that'd be a good idea, but they could. Yes?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that it's not preempted.
Most people don't know that. It's actually a very common mistake. A very common mistake.
So is it still the law of the land? I mean, how is that the supreme law of the land?
But what does it mean to the supreme law of the land, right? If the feds arrest you, Jay, right? Say you have marijuana in your backyard in Colorado, right? The feds arrest you and say, but wait a minute, Judge, I have this Colorado statute, right, that says I can grow this. That's not a valid defense. But the Colorado law is still in the books, right? The Colorado law remains on the books because the states are regulating something in their police power, right? Now, I'll give you the opposite example, right? So when states try to regulate immigration, for example, Texas has this sanctuary city bill, if a state law actually interferes with a federal law, that's when the problem arises. But Colorado's marijuana law exists in a haze of harmony, if you will, with the federal law, right? It perhaps undercuts it, but it's just like, look, if you guys want to light up, light up. Now, the problem actually arises with financial instruments, right? Because if you're a bank in Colorado and under state law you can get deposits from dispensaries and marijuana growers, right? That's probably against federal law too. So even though you're probably acting lawfully under state law, you're breaking federal law, and you can get arrested and go to jail for life. And their statute of limitations are long on that. So if you're a business actually distributing marijuana, you're doing so at the grace of the government, that they don't prosecute you. And in fact, there was a big concern when the administration shifted of whether there'd be a crackdown on local marijuana businesses. Because the federal marijuana laws are still in the books, they're just not being enforced. But thank you. Did everyone get that? I think Brittany and Jay are on the right track, right? Colorado can't be commandeered to criminalize marijuana. They can't. They can't. It would be unconstitutional otherwise.
So then if the federal government just made marijuana legal completely, would states have to comply and then not criminalize?
But they can go over it though, right? Let's say tomorrow Congress in Washington decides to legalize pot. Would Texas be under any obligation to follow suit? Absolutely not. Texas could still ban it if they wanted to.
That's the same as the environmental laws in California are greater than the federal.
Yeah, federal law provides a floor, right? A floor of enforcement. States can go below that, or sometimes they can go above it, right? Generally, you can't go below it, but if Congress rescinds their marijuana laws, yeah, you can. Yeah, Jackson.
So I think I'm just missing the point on the preemption. Why does it not? That's what, I just can't wrap my head around that.
So preemption is largely beyond the scope of this class, but the point is this: Congress can't make a state criminalize something, right? So Colorado's laws permitting marijuana are valid, but the reason why preemption arises is if, say, you're prosecuted by the feds and you defend yourself with a state statute, the state statute provides no defense for you.
So the two laws can just coexist together without being a problem?
Yeah, and the feds don't like it. They can send ATF agents and they can send DEA agents to Denver and they can start arresting all the people on 420, right? So, I mean, that they can do that. This is not well known. This is probably not on Google, but this is an attribute of rage people don't quite appreciate. Yeah, Brandon.
So can I guess a state can't keep DEA agents out of its territory. Can a state?
That would be problematic. If a state told DEA agents get out of our borders, I think you'd have McCulloch v. Maryland problems, right? Where the state of Maryland tried to tax a federal bank. That I think would be a problem.
Based on.
Well, if you remember the facts of McCulloch v. Maryland, right? The state of Maryland tried to pose a tax to put the federal bank out of business. That is a problem. It's actually interfering with the federal program.
But isn't it based on a power, on the taxing power?
Well, the Bank of the United States was upheld under the necessary and proper power, but the case arose when Maryland tried to punish a state bank. And because because the federal bank was constitutional, Maryland couldn't put it out of business, right? The states can't shut down a federal institution. That, Marshall said, is problematic. The power to tax, the power to destroy. Yes, Benjamin.
How do DEA agents have policing power within the state except by the grace of the state giving the DEA agents the policing power without the federal government taking the policing power from the states?
So now we're veering to some dangerous ground. There are some, I don't want to use the word fringe, but I will. There are some fringe theory who say that the federal government has no power to even enter the territories without even state permission. If that's the case, then much of federal law enforcement in the last 100 years is illegal, and practice has a measure of significance for me. But if we start saying that the feds can't enter the sovereign state of Colorado, we start going back to the Civil War, I think, at that point. That's a problem.
Isn't the counter to that, though, if you take federal funding, you've kind of invited them into your...
Well, if you accept federal funding, they can put strings on it, right?
Yeah.
All states do, but that's
But
not
the
enough.
Fed into your state by accepting them.
Yeah, they need consent to quarter the troops, right? So I think you still need something. Third Amendment. But I still think you need something. But I get your intuition. I'm not quite there. You're not wrong, but I think practice would dictate that answer's not correct. But I mean, there's a reason why Congress created a federal capital in the District of Columbia that was not within any state. Right? You don't think about this. The reason why is they wanted a jurisdiction that was separate from any state control. Like they didn't want Pennsylvania or Philadelphia or New York to like start shutting down and impose taxes in this federal jurisdiction. They wanted their own federal district. And that's why the federal district doesn't have senators or members of Congress, right? It wasn't meant to be a place people lived. I mean, now there are lots of people there. But it was designed to be this specific federal district where the federal government had total sovereignty. And territories as well. Actually, so Benjamin, to answer your question a little bit more, in Dred Scott, Roger Taney basically argued that the federal government has no power to control things in the states. It's not the best precedent to stand on. You might not be wrong, but it's been not.
Well, I was going to ask if there's any, is there any legal precedent with the establishment of the FBI? Did any of the states contest the FBI's authority?
Well, but Congress can regulate interstate commerce, right? And to the extent that a state is interfering with the regulation of interstate commerce, that state law has to give way. And so I suspect most of the Commerce Clause, most of the FBI is premised on the Commerce Clause. It had some predecessors for federal crimes, but it generally began by regulating, organized crime, mafia, trafficking across state lines. So there actually was a nexus to interstate commerce. But I think, going back to Brandon's question, if a state denied entry to a federal officer, I think they'll give rise to McCulby, Maryland problems. Because you're destroying federal institutions. I mean, that's basically Fort Sumter, right? Civil War. You had federal troops in South Carolina, they opened fire. We had a civil war over that. So it's probably not the best route to go down. All right, other questions? So let's get back to the case, right? So Scalia's analysis puts a lot of weight on the Supremacy Clause. And because judges are bound, he says, the implications that executive branch officials are not bound. Because in the early days of the country, right, state courts would be required to do stuff, but state legislatures, he said, would not. Okay? Also, we don't have history of executive branch officials being commandeered. Right? He says there are examples where, for example, governors of states were asked to provide troops for a war. Now the key word is they were asked, they weren't required. Nothing stops Congress from asking states to do stuff, but they can't be compelled to do so. And so this raises the question, right? Brandon, I think this was your question a minute ago. What weight should practice get? Let me ask the question differently. The Constitution doesn't really give the commandeering doctrine in so many words. They have to sort of pick it apart. But what do we make of the fact that for 200 years, the executive branches of the states were never told what to do by Congress, right? What should that tell us about how our Constitution is structured if something had never been done before? This was an unprecedented action.
I mean, either the issue had never surfaced.
Good. So what do we make of the fact the issue never surfaced? What does that probably mean?
no one ever thought it constitutional to do so, to ask?
Good. Very good. Everything we just said. Repeat it one more time. Say it one more time.
I think I said, no one ever thought it constitutional.
Right.
or
So if
lawful.
no one in 200 years had ever tried to commandeer a state executive branch official, that's pretty good evidence that no one thought it was lawful, right? Consider the opposite. Let's say that for 200 years, nonstop, since the time of George Washington, that Congress told state sheriffs what to do. There were sheriffs back then, they existed. So if we had a practice of it for 200 years, Congress told sheriffs what to do, that's a pretty good indication that Congress has the power to do this. It's not, 100%, but it's a pretty good indication. But the absence of that conflict, right? You never had a single instance, not one, where Congress made such a request. That it was never asked suggests that maybe Congress does not have this power. This is a good illustration of how practice, that is, how real-world experience informs the Supreme Court's separation of powers case law. That if something is never done, it's probably not supposed to be done. But the flip side is, once it's done, it's a new precedent. And if, say, the court had upheld commandeering here, maybe it could have upheld somewhere else. So this sort of, I'll call it the unprecedented argument that's never been done before, works only once. Because as soon as Congress does it, like, oh, well, they did it here, so they can do it again. So because this was the first time that this had happened, the court said, no farther, we're not going there. You can't do that. And the Obamacare decision was much the same way. That's why the title of my first book was Unprecedented, because the argument was the Affordable Care Act's mandate was unprecedented. Okay? Everyone understand that? Now, Amber, Scalia talks a little bit about political accountability, right? And how this Brady Act distorts political accountability. Why is that the case?
Because it causes for the people that are elected in the state to now not be trusted as much.
Yeah. So yeah, very good. So think of Sheriff Printz here, right? He's popular in the town. He's the sheriff. He's elected. He's the coroner. He sees when you're born. Sees when you're dead, right? Cradle to grave. But now the people have to vote for him, and he was elected. Know that this is this jerk who didn't let me buy a handgun because he took too long, right? Whereas it's actually Congress that imposed this requirement. So everyone see the problem here, right? What Scalia says, and this is also building on O'Connor in New York, is that this distorts accountability. You don't know who to hold responsible for these actions. You want to blame Sheriff Printz, but it's not really his fault. He's simply following federal law. And because it distorts political accountability, they say the law doesn't suffice. That this violates it. Now, Scalia moves on to the final argument, which he calls the last best hope of defending ultra vires congressional action. Ultra vires means illegal, beyond the scope. What is that? The necessary and proper clause, the last best hope. So Scalia says, regulating the sale of handguns under the commerce and necessary and proper clause establishes validity, right? But when a law carrying to execution commerce clause violates state sovereignty, it is not a law proper for carrying into execution. This is Jaya's question like half hour ago, right? When a law carrying into execution the commerce clause violates state sovereignty, and that's reflected in the 10th Amendment, right? It is not a law proper for carrying into execution. That is, a law is not proper if it violates state sovereignty. And what precedent does he cite for that? He only got one, really. New York, right? He cites O'Connor. And O'Connor says Congress lacks power to compel states to require or prohibit acts. Does this really fit with O'Connor's opinion in New York? Not perfectly. It's a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. But the bottom line is that he says under the court's current jurisprudence, Congress can't compel. It's not a proper exercise of federal power. There's no difference between making law and enforcing it. And there you have it, right? New York was about whether they can make law. This is about whether they can enforce it. He says there's no difference. They can't do either. And in fairness to Scalia, I think Case mentioned this a few minutes ago. Sheriff Printz may not have to pass a statute, but he has to make decisions. He has to reprioritize. He may have to hire a new deputy to go and run background checks, right? He may have to decide, man, I can't embalm this guy because I have to go run a background check now, right? He has to make tough decisions. Killer decision, right? In effect, officers are dragooned into administering federal law. And this, Scalia says, is unconstitutional. But wait a minute, didn't Printz say over and over again, David, that Congress can regulate individuals? Didn't we say they can impose taxes, they can regulate how much wheat you grow? Why is this not that? Why is this different? Because it's Sheriff Printz.
Because they're trying to force an official of the state to enact.
Yeah, and that's a key point. He says it's not, Sheriff Printz is not J. Printz individual. He is the sheriff of the government. He's elected. He holds some sort of office within the state government. So because he holds an office within the state government, right, he is not simply an individual. He represents part of the state's sovereignty. So what Printz does is it expands New York rule to attach to executive branch officials of the state and say that commandeering them is not a proper exercise of federal power. So this put the states largely beyond the limits. And this is a decision that sanctuary city advocates scream at the top of their lungs, right? A case that rose out of gun control is now helping the sanctuary cities, but that's fine. Cases often come back in ways you don't quite expect them. All right, let's do the Stevens dissent. Boone, Justice Stevens is very livid here. He's not happy. By the way, before I get to the bottom, a couple years ago, Justice Stevens wrote a book called 6 Amendments. He proposed 6 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and or maybe it was 5 amendments. I can never remember. They're not good. But one of them was to overturn Printz by statute. Right? By amendment. He wants to overturn the Printz decision by amendment. Let me give it to you. And I want you to see how he proposed it. It's actually a very smart way that he did it, because I think it makes Scalia's point inadvertently. This is the Justice Stevens amendment. Let me paste it for you. Okay. And actually, let me put this side by side with this Supremacy Clause so you can even see it. Right, so that's the Supremacy Clause. This is Stevens. He basically adds 4 words to the Supremacy Clause. You see that? He adds 4 words to the Supremacy Clause. He says, and the judges and other public officials in every state shall be bound hereby. I don't know if he quite realized it, but he basically concedes Scalia's point. He basically concedes Scalia's textual point that the omission of executive and legislative officials in the Supremacy Clause suggests that they can't be bound. So Stevens would simply overturn Printz by an amendment, which has 0% chance of passing now, by adding 4 words to the amendment. That now judges and all public officials shall be bound. Now what's a public official? We can argue that perhaps later. But it's a pretty broad language. Okay? But, I'm gonna have to, Boone, yeah, back to you, sorry. Yeah, I gave you a reprieve. Why does Justice Stevens think that this commandeering doctrine is like basically a fiction?
He thinks the 10th Amendment doesn't, he's one of the ones that says it's like full-on prison, doesn't add anything.
Adds nothing, right? Just restates Article 1, Section 8.
Right. And he says that, just like the complete opposite, he says if anything, the state officials are bound by oath and they have an essential agency in giving effect to the federal constitution.
Very
so
good.
He's like, he wants, yeah.
He thinks this doctrine is completely made up. And he basically says there's one case and one case only that supports this, which is, New York. Right? There's only one case. And as we discussed a few minutes ago, it wasn't particularly well reasoned, right? So Stevens thinks that this claim is completely made up. And he also discusses how, if this decision is taken seriously, it can make the government have a very difficult task. And he uses this example over and over again. What happens if some sort of a civil war or some sort of domestic outbreak, and the president needs the governor to rally some troops, right? Could the Congress not commandeer the governor to put troops forward? So the answer actually is yes, he could. Under the Constitution, Congress has the power to raise a militia. So there actually is other means by which the problem Stevens addresses can be resolved. But he's very much convinced that this doctrine is made up. And it's to his credit, the court doesn't really explain it. The only hook they have is the text of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, which Stevens tries to amend later on. But at bottom, we have this doctrine, this commandeering doctrine, which after New York and Printz stands for this rule. It stands for the rule that executive branch officials of the states, legislative branch officials of the states cannot be told what to do, only judicial branch officials. And the effect of this decision, ironically enough, is to shield the sanctuary cities, to say that cities are not compelled to enforce. Questions? Yes?
Are attorneys considered judicial officials?
I don't think so. No. I mean, you take an oath to the Constitution when all of you are sworn in to the bar in a couple of years. You all take an oath to the Constitution, but it's not an oath under the Supremacy Clause. It's an oath imposed by the Texas bar examiners.
So because it's by the state and not...
I think that means judges. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't say judge. I mean, Stevens said public official. That's fake. That's fake law. The Constitution actually says judges. So you're not a judge, but maybe if you are, one day you will be. And it makes sense to have judges enforcing federal law. Why? You can bring federal claims in state court. You study that in CIPRO. State judges are often entertaining federal courts of action, federal causes of action. You may have a judgment from some other state, and you're going to have to enforce that. As a state judge, you may have a foreign judgment you have to enforce, right? So it makes sense to bind judges because causes of action are transitory. They move from here to there. Sheriff Printz, though, his jurisdiction is only in Raleigh County, Montana. He can't go arrest someone in Staten Island or Houston. He doesn't have the power to. So his power is constrained. And that's where he has the police power. Literally the police power. Questions? Questions? No? That's all I got. I will see you on Thursday. Thank you.